All right, today we are going to be looking at Athens and the transitions that took place to have it shift to democracy. So we looked at Sparta last time and how they developed. Athens took a different route with colonization. Whereas what we talked about with Sparta, right, they expanded on land. And so with colonization, they spread out to various islands. And this is going to create a different structure than by land. And what you end up having is not only independent city-states that develop, but also a difference in wealth, which was significantly more than Sparta, although of course Sparta structure of society specifically went away from emphasizing wealth. But you had which was talked about with Archaic Period, right? Trade and what took place there increased that wealth. And then the major difference in the military is that while Sparta was a land power, Athens was a naval power, and they were a naval power in part because of the move with colonization and as people spread out in long distance trade. And so you really do end up getting this kind of dichotomy between Athens and Sparta. Sparta as a land power, right, and Athens as a naval power. And that's going to come to head with the Peloponnesian War. And we'll look at that at a different time. But that you have the two, Athens and Sparta, that really become the main dominating powers in Greece during the classical period. Only to decline ultimately with the Hellenistic period because they fight themselves into decline. So they both rose with the before the Persian Wars and at the height of the Persian Wars, and then fell fighting each other in the end. So Athens ended up having to deal with a lot of early issues that took place. The first was economic in nature and had to do with their location, specifically land issues. The area it's part of the reason why they don't expand, the area or land mass around Attica where Athens is located, did not have as much availability in land, so it was smaller land resources. The other issue that emerged with it is that you had a small percentage of nobility that ended up controlling a lot of the land. And this happened because of the rule that sons would inherit equally, and this became difficult to maintain. This also created then a stark contrast between the nobility and impoverished peasants. And you really ended up having the elite that ruled and controlled economically in Athens, and then the peasants that were losing their land because they couldn't maintain it through generations. You also had a specific issue with crops, specifically that their main crops were olives and grapes for wine, but these were vine plants. The issue with vine plants is that they take a long time to cultivate, and this can create economic issues. It's also, of course, missing a key type of agricultural component, which is grains for food, right? Olives and grapes for wine is great, but that doesn't help feed the population. And so you had an abundance of olives and wine and less with viable crop production. This leads, along with the issue of the sons and inheriting equally to what became known as the 1/6 debt, which created a significant problem within Athens. So what this is, so let's say a family, right, it only takes a few generations and your plot of land is too small to really produce enough for survival. And a lot of the smaller farms were the ones that were actually producing grains that were needed for food. So this is going to create a food shortage as well. And so what you have is that they aren't viable for survival. So you go to get a loan, but there aren't a traditional banks in that sense. Rather, the loan goes to the nobility and the wealthy nobility, because of course there was some nobility that were not that extreme high level nobility. So you go to the really elite and you get a loan, and then what they had to do is you paid 1/6 of crop production. You had to put stones around your farm to indicate that you were in debt, which is just an additional stigma to that. And then if you couldn't pay back in production and pay back the loan, then which most could not do. That was part of the problem, is that they weren't able to pay back the loan. Then what happened is that your farm was taken as the debt owed, but that wasn't enough. They didn't stop there, right? You think, okay, well, you lose your farm. Yes, but you were also sold into slavery to recoup additional costs. So it was problematic and slowly deteriorating the entire smaller farm population of Athens, as well as creating a significant gap between the extremely wealthy and the poor. The second issue that was taking place, or that was problematic, had to do with blood feuds. Now, blood feuds had specifically were an issue for nobility. This didn't usually come into issue with the lower classes. But blood feuds were connected to this idea of honor and family and an obligation that if someone in your family died, then you had to avenge their death. So and you had to avenge their death by killing the person that was responsible. The problem with this is, of course, that once you kill the person responsible for your family member's death, their family now becomes obligated to kill whoever enacted the first blood feud, right? So their family becomes, say, obligated to kill you, and so on, right? And it creates this vicious cycle of death. And it doesn't end until essentially one family line is wiped out altogether and there's no one to avenge that person's death. And both of these things were very problematic in early Athens. What we have that leads to democracy is actually a series of tyrants that take over. Now, these are not, they don't come sequentially. It's not one after the other. Rather, these are just the main tyrants that made significant changes in Athens until it led up to democracy. So there were periods of time in between each of these people, but we're going to look at the main tyrants that made significant changes in Athens. The first was Draco. Draco had a couple of things that he did. One is that he created written law codes. It's actually where we get the word draconian, so that should tell you something about the law codes. They were not super friendly. by any means. They were pretty harsh. But the important part being, right, having written law codes in of itself is an important kind of step with justice, of being able to have written codes that people can't manipulate or change it because you don't know what they are. And that helps protect people, even if they are initially pretty harsh. The other thing that he tackled was the blood feuds. And so he looked to stop that cycle that was taking place and introduce the idea of intent, right? Because the blood feud, it didn't matter what your intent was, right? Whether it was accidental, intentional, or even that you were innocent, right? Any of those things, if you were perceived to have killed or been responsible for the death, whether it was an accident or that you didn't do it, or that you intentionally went out and killed someone, the blood feud was essentially, the families were obligated out of that sense of honor and family to enact the blood feud and kill you, which then, like I said, that kick-started off the cycle that never ended until whole families were kind of wiped out by that process. So what he did is that he created the idea of sanctuary at temples. At the main temple, although you probably could have gone to any smaller temple. They had the main temple in Athens, and that if you made it to, so if you were accused of murder, and whether you were innocent, accidental, or technically even intentionally, you could go to the sanctuary. It was meant, of course, to target accidental deaths and innocent. And so you'd go to the temple and you would claim sanctuary, and you would before the temple proclaim, right, what happened. And whether that was that you were claiming you were innocent or that it was an accident. And as long as no supernatural event happened while you were proclaiming your innocence, so don't go do this during a thunderstorm, because that would suck. I swear I did not kill a person, and then thunder crashes down. Welp, guess the gods have spoken. You're a liar. And then it would the whole thing wouldn't go through. But assuming you didn't choose to go, flee to the temple and claim sanctuary on a thunderstorm, windstorm day, and no supernatural event happened when you proclaimed what happened in your innocence, or that it was an accident, then the family, which was reinforced by laws that Draco set up, were then obligated to accept that. And this ended a lot of the blood feuds and the deaths. Now, from this is where it's going to eventually transform to a jury system and trial. So this is what it evolves to. So it starts off as just a sanctuary thing, and then it moves to where you would actually have a trial. You'd go to court. You were often your own lawyer, and you had to convince the jury, which were Athenian citizens, of your innocence, or I suppose of the other person's guilt. And then the jury would decide that fate. You have there's a 3-part play, which was the Orestia, which written by Aeschylus. And the 3 parts of the play actually talk about the transition to this. So you have the first one is about Agamemnon and what happens to him after the Trojan War. So he comes back. Well, you need the start of the story that you need to know is that he, in order to get to the Trojan War, he sacrificed his daughter. There were no winds happening, and he was afraid that he was going to miss the war, which of course ended up being ironic since it was 10 years. He could have taken his sweet time and still made it to the war. So he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. The wind started up. He was able to go to war. His wife, Clytemnestra, was then left in charge of the palace and the kingdom for the 10 years that he was gone. She does not like him, understandably so, considering he sacrificed their daughter. She ends up taking up with another guy while he's gone, hoping he's just dead. And then he comes back. And the whole story then is about her plot to kill him, which she successfully does. So he dies. That's the first play. The second play then is about their son Orestes. And this one, so once he finds out that his mom killed his father, the blood feud is enacted. However, this play is all about his dilemma about killing his mother. Because it was seen in Athens that two of the worst crimes that you could commit were patricide first, because of course it was a patriarchal society and killing your father or a male was worse than a female, but matricide was a close second, right? So he's debating in this play the whole time whether he should kill his mother. Yes, I have the blood feud oath and requirement, but at the same time that's matricide. Should I not? Clytemnestra shows up on and off through the play kind of as a kind of crappy person, so it doesn't make you feel too sorry for her. You feel bad for her in the first one, and then you're kind of like, oh, you're kind of a horrible person. and so he ultimately decides he has to kill his mother because of that. Of course, matricide ultimately, we'll put it here, brings out the Furies. And the third play is about that. The Furies are vengeful spirits, and they come out to attack and destroy Orestes for killing his mother, for committing matricide. And so he, with the help of Apollo, flees to the temple of Athena, where then he petitions Athena for mercy. And what she sets up then is the jury system and trial, where he goes on trial. She brings in Athenian citizens. She's like the judge. And the Furies present their case. Orestes, with some help of Apollo, presents his case. The Athenian citizens vote, and Athena gives the final vote to decide that Orestes should be spared, and that the Furies change from vengeful spirits to protective spirits of justice, essentially. So they become less like evil or fearful, they're scary spirits, the Furies. They become less scary after that. Now their job is to be spirits of justice, not just vengeful spirits in that process. But what's interesting with this play, right, is that all three of these, it showcases in this story Athens' transition from blood feud to a trial and jury system. They're an interesting 3 plays. They're a good story. So that's Draco again starts the process with the ending the blood feuds, and then his law codes, which are important. After Draco, you have the tyrant Solon. Again, time passes, and then Solon's going to come in and take over. And he is going to address 2 things. He's going to look at economic issues, and he's going to have a significant transformation with the government. So with the economic issues, we come back to the actually, I'm going to take rid of these numbers here because we're going to put them here. So these are the 2 issues that he's going to deal with. With the economic, he addresses that 1/6 debt. Right? You have that problem that was going on. Now, Athens at this time had a significant food shortage, and specifically with that grain problem. And they had lots of olives and wine, but that's not really going to feed you, and it's slightly problematic. So what he does is he actually abolishes the practice of the 1/6 debt and says, you can't do this anymore. It's not allowed, because it was a predatory practice that only benefited the ultra rich. And then he outlaws Athenians from being sold into slavery, so that they're no longer, they can't be sold to any Athenian citizen. Now, that's not, other people can be slaves, but Athenian citizens cannot be sold into slavery. He also bought back, buys any of the Athenians that he could find that were slaves. So he couldn't find everyone, but with his own money too. So anyone that had been sold into slavery through the 1/6 debt, with his own money, he purchased back. And then it said, no one can be sold into slavery. He also freed serfs as well, which serfs are tied to the land, which are a little bit different than slaves, which can be transferred around from person to person. Serfs tend to get connected to the land itself. The other thing that he did with the food shortage is that he, we'll put the grain shortage here again. He bans export of grains. So he says you can't sell that. This largely impacted the nobility, because they were the ones that had the large land that could afford to do that. The lower classes, or those that were small time farmers, they didn't have enough grain to export it out of Attica, and so that has to stay in, which of course helped the price lower. So lowered prices, which had skyrocketed because of the shortage of grain. Then olive oil and wine could still be exported, but they had a ton of that. So that it wasn't a ban on exports of all agricultural products, just the grain. And then he allowed lower classes, those that were in debt, to have it be wiped free and keep their farms. Specifically because he was trying to encourage, grain agriculture and feeding the people as well. Now, so that's the economic changes he made. Remember, tyrants that we saw with Archaic Period, they they weren't bad at this point in time, or they weren't seen as bad. They were seen as a natural check and balance. And this is what's happening, right? Draco comes in and sets up law codes, ends the blood feuds. Solon comes in and restructures the economic basis of Athens to help the lower classes. And tyrants almost always helped in some way the lower classes. They were nobility themselves, but it was through popular support that they got their power. And then they made economic, government reform, educational reform, which was often very popular and needed, hence the natural check and balance that was taking place. Now, for the changes in government, he's going to restructure how that takes place. If we look with the Archaic period, and we talked about this one before, it was based on birth, right? You have the archon, the military commander, and then you had the magistrates, the council of elders, and then the general assembly, right? So this is the Archaic period, and this is what had changed from the Dark Ages, where it was just the regional kings and nobility. This was all still nobility, which is by birth, and this was all male citizens. So you had some improvement with the start of the Archaic period, right? And so he's going to change this structure from birth to a wealth-based system. And what he's going to do is that he's going to divide the populace into four, what he called tribes, that were based on wealth. So the first tribe were the 500 measurement. And these are based on land ownership. So land and agricultural production. Right, that was based on that. These were almost always nobility. The second group were mounted units, which is connected to the ability to afford horses and usually their role in the military. This is still pretty wealthy. This was around what was considered a 300 measure of land. They could afford and have oxen. You did have hoplite soldiers, cavalry units from this group. So that's with the military. Then the next group that you had were the men of Yoke. Men of Yoke has to do with agriculture as well. Well, all of these really do. The yoke part, right, is the idea that you could afford oxen to plow your land, so that you still had land. A lot of hoplite soldiers were here. There were hoplite soldiers in the mounted units as well, but the majority of the hoplite soldiers went in here. These were smaller farmers, right? These were a lot of the farmers that had been going into difficulty, with the 1/6 debt, that really had smaller plots of land, but still enough to have an oxen, which is you yoke an oxen. It's what you put over the oxen's head to yoke it up to the till to till your land. So that's where that name comes from. And then the last group was called the Thetes, or hired help. That's what the Thetes is. So the hired help were laborers, right? They're the ones that don't own land. You work for hired help as you work for money. And this obviously made up the poor and not military, because you still had to have enough wealth to be a hoplite soldier, because you had to buy your own gear. So if you were of the Thetes or hired help, then you were not going to be part of the hoplite soldiers. So with the 4 tribes, what he did is he made what was called the Council of 400, right? And how you get that is you get 100 people from each tribe. And this was drawn by lots each year. So each year it changed who was in the council. So what the final government structure was under Solon, that was based on wealth, was that you had the archon still, which was the leader. Then you had a military commander, so this part didn't change, nor did the magistrates. But then where it does change is that you have the Council of 400 instead of elders, and then you have the General Assembly. So in 2 positions now, all male citizens could now participate in the government. These were these positions here, the archon, military commander, and magistrates, they were elected, but it was based on wealth now. So technically, right, what's the significant difference between nobility and birth and wealth? Well, in nobility, you're born into it. You can't move up. You can't ever get into that position. You're either born into it or you're not. Technically, although it was difficult to do, you could become part of the magistrates or even archon, but archon and military commander were much more that's one position for both of those. But the magistrates were only available in the top tribes. So it was often nobility, right? Most of the time that was nobility, but technically, because it was based on wealth rather than birth, you had the potential to move up. And again, now you have 2 positions in the government where women were not part of this, and non-citizens were not. All male Athenian citizens of 18 or older could be in the General Assembly and Council of 400, and you had an opportunity each year to do so. General Assembly, anyone could show up and vote, because again, that's what you did. You voted on laws and different things with the government. The Council of 400 worked on laws. The magistrates did the day-to-day running of the government, and the archon, of course, was the leader. So there was potential to, everyone had the possibility to be part of the laws, and you got to vote, and potentially if you became wealthy, you could move up to have a chance to be part of the magistrates as well. And so that's kind of the importance, right? When you have a shift from birth to wealth, is that it gives you some additional opportunities to participate in the government in different ways that were not present before. Now, after, again, it goes back, he steps down eventually, has this new government that's now been formed. Things go on for a while, but then you start having abuse of power again that takes place, and Cleisthenes is going to be the last tyrant that takes over and is going to essentially expand upon Solon's reform. But instead of it being on wealth, it's going to shift to geography. And this is going to create a democratic system of government. What he does is he's going to take the same idea of kind of the tribes, only he's going to create 10 tribes. And he's going to create the tribes not by wealth, but by geographic structure. He divided all of Athens into demes and trides. Now, the demes, there were 139 to 149 demes. And these were kind of like districts, is a good way to think of it. And it was just divided up, and Attica was divided up into these regions. And treaties is by 3. And so what he did with this is that from the demies, he then divides it into 3 parts. The city, it's like the 3 C's, the country, and the coast. And you say that you have these different demies, and of these different demies, you have regions that represent the cities, the city, the country, and the coast. And from these, they were randomly put into 10 tribes. And I know this is a little confusing with how this is. So basically, in groups of 3 would be 1 treaty. Right? And then you would create these treaties, and then each treaty would be randomly put into the 10 tribes. So when you come out of it, the whole purpose of this is to create a cross-section of representation. Because the argument for, and it's both random, but also not entirely, also not. Okay, so the idea with this is right, is that yes, if you just divide them up into demies, the problem that you can get is that you get a demi that's this part of the city, and the demi that's part of the city is going to have different issues, wants, desires, needs, economic, political, whatever, social, from the demis that are the country, or demis that are coastal. And so if you kept them just in demis to be the representatives and break them up into tribes, then the problem was, if all the demis of the city were represented, that means the country and the coastal areas are not represented. So by creating treaties where you have representation from city, country, and coastal, and put it into a tribe, it makes sure that each tribe is a cross-section of the region, right? Where you have representation in each tribe from the 3 main areas, country, coastal, city. So hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, I know this part is often confusing. Think of it as the important part being that you're just creating a cross-section of representation between those 3 areas in each tribe. And then from the 10 tribes, he's going to create a similar and yet different structure for the government. And so what we'll do is I'll put, well, from the 10 tribes, you're going to get the Council of 500. We'll do it in order, though, and put that in to explain. So it's 50 people from each tribe, right, that make up the Council of 500. And just like the Council of 400, it changed each year. So we'll put up the different ones here, and then we'll explain. You have Archon. I call it Archon for the day, and we'll explain those after we get all of them up here. Then you have what were called the Prytanes. And then you have the Council of 500. And then you have the General Assembly. So this is the new structure of government that he set up. So how each one works, the General Assembly is the same. It's all male citizens. And they vote, right? That's your job. You get to vote on laws and other things like that. Anyone can participate. The Council of 500 came from 50 people from each tribe. And it was drawn by lot, right? Which is like picking a name out of a hat each year. Okay, so the General Assembly, the Council of 500, and they were the ones that, just like the Council of 400, they helped create the laws of the area. The Prytanes were 50 people chosen by lot from the Council of 500. So if you were a citizen and your name was drawn for the Council of 500, which meant then you were going to be part of the government and running it for a year, then from once they had their 500 people, they drew by lot again. And from now just the 500 people, right? The drawn by lot was all male citizens to get the Council of 500 from all the tribes. And then the Prytanes was drawn by lot from the Council of 500, and you end up with 50 people. They were responsible for the day-to-day running of the city of Athens. And this was yearly as well. And then Archon for the day, why I call that, it wasn't exactly the title, but it makes more sense if you do this. Each day, so the other ones are yearly, right? One person from the Prytanes, from the 50 people in the Prytanes, was chosen by lot. And each day it rotated. So everyone in the if you were one of the 50 of the Prytanes, you were going to be chosen by lot a couple of times a year to be Archon for the day. You had veto power basically, or tiebreaker stuff. It was that's all it really was for. It was not a position of power. It was not meant to be a position of power. You were there to make sure that if the Prytanes got stuck on something, or there was something horrible idea they were trying to come up with, that you could, move things forward or stop something from happening. But then the next day, it was a completely different person. And this was intentional because the fear was if you had an actual Archon, a leader, that they could end up taking over power from the people. Because now here's the thing, right? All of these positions are any male citizen. And it's random, right? It's completely drawn by lot. There are no restrictions. The wealthiest person to the poorest beggar could end up in any of these positions. And this is going to fundamentally change Athens because of the nature of now having the possibility that any male citizen, again, not anyone, I say anyone, but there's still the laws of exclusion, and women were excluded from this, very much so. That any male citizen had the ability to participate in the government and make a difference. Now, there were a couple other things. One of the things that you might have noticed is that the military commander was not on that list anymore, because there was they removed him out of the position of government, so not in the central government anymore. The other thing, of course, is that they were elected, because you didn't want it'd be bad if your military commander was drawn by lot. You imagine, it's like, oh, this is Paul, and he's going to be our military commander, and he's never fought a day in his life. Good luck. You need someone who actually knows what they're doing, so that has to be an elected position. So it's moved out of the central government and the running of the government, and the position is off to the side, essentially. And they're elected, but they're not within the position of power of helping run the government and make laws, because, of course, there was this fear and concern that they would be able to take over in power. So by removing them from the central government, you provide that type of protection. And then the other thing that they did as a check and balance, because now there's tyrants are not checks and balances anymore. A tyrant, this is where it shifts to the word tyrant becoming bad, because of course now they're taking away power from the people, whereas before they were a check and balance. So instead, ostracism is the new check and balance, and it's where we get the word ostracize today. How it worked is that you had each year the General Assembly met. I mean, the General Assembly met more than that, but each year they met for the ostracism. And what they would do is that they'd say, okay, this is the vote for ostracism, and everyone would vote if they wanted to ostracize someone or not. So you would just, everyone that was present for this, and these often had a lot of people present for it, and you would decide, okay, do we want to vote for it? And so they would take a vote, and you would write yes to ostracize or no, right, to have an ostracism. If if over half of the total people present voted yes, and that was not the only condition, and over 5,000 people voted. So you had to, the thing is that they didn't want it to be where like, hey, I totally hate my neighbor, I'm going to get all my friends and family to vote to ostracize my neighbor. No, you can't do that. You had to have over 5,000 people vote in this vote. So if 5,000 people didn't show up to the annual vote for ostracism, it didn't go through. If more than 5,000 people showed up, but they didn't vote, it didn't go through. And then from that 5,000, over half of them had to vote yes, they wanted to have an ostracism. So even if 20 people, even if 1,000 people voted yes, that wasn't enough. And then, so let's say it goes through though. Over 5,000 people vote for it, and over half of those 5,000 say yes. Then the next question would be, who do you want to ostracize? Again, they set in motion the idea that you can't, or there's protections for it, that you can't just say, oh, my neighbor. You had to have from that, that you had to have you still had to have a large number of people voting. So it had to be over 5,000 people. So the assumption was, of course, if you voted yes to ostracize, that then you would vote for this. But then they had to have a majority on the name too. Right? So you had to have a majority to say yes, you wanted to ostracize, and then you had to have a majority of the people saying the same name. So this was not easy to ostracize someone. The whole purpose of this check and balance was to if someone was trying to take over politically, right, basically potentially a tyrant, that you could stop it, right, that they had a way to stop it. How they stopped it is, so then if they did, let's say you had a majority and the right number of people to not only vote for the ostracism, most years an ostracism didn't happen because it didn't meet the qualifications. But let's say that one year it did, and then you had over half the half of the people vote for the same person. Then what would happen is that it would move to exile. And the person would be exiled for 10 years out of Athens, but they maintained their property. Now, there was a harsher exile for 20 years and you lost your property, but that was for like kind of repeat offenders or serious crimes. The idea behind this is that they would be gone long enough that they would lose influence and power. And when they finally came back, they would have no ability to overthrow the government or disrupt the government. The purpose for maintaining property was that your family could stay in Athens, right? And you didn't lose, all your wealth, so that you could have a life when you came back. But the idea is that then you were going to be powerless when you came back. In terms of any of the governments would have shifted multiple times, the people, the politics, all of that would have shifted multiple times. And so that wasn't going to be an issue anymore. Exile was seen as I think we think of it like, oh, that doesn't really sound like that harsh of a punishment. Exile was seen as a horrible thing, both for the Greeks and the Romans. People lamented when it happened, because the reality is that you didn't feel like you fit in anywhere else. There were lots of laws and restrictions in many of the city-states in Greece that limited people's participation, ability to be involved in society. You felt disconnected from your family. You couldn't see your family. They could come visit you, but you were like almost a non-citizen for those 10 years. And for people, remember, we saw this shift. Citizenship became incredibly important. The idea of I'm an Athenian, I'm a Spartan, I'm a Corinthian. People identified with their city-state. So to be exiled from it was seen as an incredibly harsh punishment, and people hated it. You couldn't purchase land, you couldn't buy property, you couldn't truly settle really in other city-states without very strict limitations, and everyone would know you were in exile, and that impacted your social life and functioning. So it was psychologically something that was seen as pretty devastating to people. So now the question becomes, what number were we on here? Let's see. Moved, I think, 3 or 4. So how does this shape Athens? Right? You have this new structure of government, and well, let's look real quick at just the structures of government all together. Right? Just to see that transition that takes place. So you have the Dark Ages. It's the Archon. No, it's not. Sorry. It's the regional king. I'm getting ahead of myself. And nobility. And this is by birth. Then you have the Archaic Period, where you now have the shift to Archon, military commander, the magistrates, the council of elders, and the general assembly. And the importance with this one was that there was one thing that was all male citizens, that the citizens could participate, but this was still nobility and by birth, right? Which is why the tyrants came into being. And then you had Solon, who changed it up with just slightly, right? The military commander, the magistrates were all the same. But now you had the Council of 400 and the General Assembly. So you have 2 areas. And the key being that this is now by wealth. And then, of course, what we just looked at with Cleisthenes, which is the complete difference of Archon for the day, which is not, again, not even a real full position at that point. No military commander, the Prytanes, the Council of 500, and the General Assembly. And all of these positions now are just by geography and lot. all male citizens. So it's nice to just see this, or we've gone over these, just several of them just today. But it's nice to see how it progresses, right? Birth, wealth, geography, all male citizens. All these ones here were all male citizens. And the slow progression of transforming to include everyone within this system. Okay, so with this, looking at the structure of government, well, how does that influence and shape the culture of Athens? And it does in a lot of ways. One of the things is that I mentioned with this is that now you have the realization by many, or the influence of democracy, right? That anyone and everyone can participate in the government now, right? And that should create a sense of being prepared, of improving oneself. And so it's going to directly impact the creation and development of philosophy, and the arts and education, as well as development of technology. And in part, some of these go together, like education directly influence technology and all of that as well. This idea of, and it's going to be a common theme through the classical period, and we looked at this with the themes from the Odyssey and the Iliad, of excellence, of how to improve oneself. And this goes for both the idea that you could be part of the government at any time, but also that even if you aren't picked, you can have influence in the government. And where we see that is with the General Assembly, right? Anyone can go and show up for that. And if you are a good public speaker, you can sway people to your position. And this is going to create a whole host of increase in education and desire to search out people that are tutors, political advisors, or those that are just looking for personal gain. So even if you don't end up, like I said, in 1 year in the government, you end up still being able to have a bunch of influence. So families started looking to find ways to educate their children, their sons, improve, and philosophy is part of that too. Philosophy comes from we'll put that, I guess, as a, we'll bring it over here. We'll put it as a separate thing here for just a second, because it already has a number over there. Philosophy in Philosophia. Sophia is wisdom. Philo is a type of love. The Greeks had several different words for love, and each word of love meant a different thing. So this is the love of wisdom. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. And that definitely goes into improving oneself and education. And then the arts, as we mentioned, are going to reflect that classical, during the classical period, are going to reflect that same idea of arete in people, in humans, right? And showcasing the ideal human form. What is possible, what could be achieved. And likewise in education and philosophy, it's that idea of excellence, the love of wisdom, of improving oneself. One of the first philosophies to develop was the Sophists. And the Sophists were essentially traveling teachers. And they went around as tutors, educating, those who could afford it in history, in literature, in government, public speaking, which was a big one. Again, all of this was done through public speaking. So being able to be proficient at that and sway and convince people. But it wasn't just enough to be a good public speaker. You needed to know your history, your literature, your government rules and structure and functions in order to be persuasive, to be someone that people would look to, whether that was that you got drawn by lot one year to be part of the government, or whether you did so through the General Assembly. And the Sophists were seen as specifically connected in developing what was called political arete, political excellence, right? That you wanted to shape your son to have that political arete so that they could have influence and power. So there became a whole new shift and focus in Athens of these developments, of these changes, all based on that transition and shift to democracy, and also the optimism that it created, because it does create a sense of optimism, and we're going to see that in the classical period. We're going to look separately at the sculptures and the philosophies of both the we'll look at the sculptures, the archaic, but then the classical and Hellenistic, and the classical and Hellenistic philosophies, the major ones. And both in the classical, both the sculptures and the philosophies represent this sense of optimism and belief of improving oneself and the ideal potential or excellence, arete, of humans. And that's in part, again, because democracy created this sense of optimism, that people were important, that everyone was important, everyone had a position and role to play within society, and the potential to shape Athens through the government. And so you're going to have these schools pop up. You're going to have these philosophy schools and mathematics schools pop up. You're going to have artists that are going to focus on showcasing that, the excellence of Athens. And that you don't see that develop in other city-states the way that it did in Athens, because Athens was the first to embrace and develop this sense of democracy, which shot out and influenced all of these other areas. All right, so that's actually a good time. So we'll stop there. What we're going to look at next time then is, we looked at just the Sophist. We'll get into them a little bit more. When we come back for the next lecture, we're going to look at the philosophies and what develops, but we're also going to look at the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, and the transition to the Hellenistic period. And then that way we can compare and contrast the classical and Hellenistic philosophies in art, because they are very much tied to the historical time period. So that's something important to remember when we look at these. And the information sheet that I provided for you, as well as when you're thinking about doing the assignment that's looking at the sculptures, is that the way that the sculptures and the philosophies are developed in the classical period are a direct reflection of what's going on in the classical period, which Athens is at its height. It's a democracy now, and they're optimistic and focused on arete. In the Hellenistic period, we'll see things have changed significantly. The Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars have happened, and Alexander the Great is going to take over and then die, and is going to shift into kingdoms largely sculpted out by his warring generals that survived him. And you're going to have a much more pessimistic view. So the classical period or I'll leave you with this, and like I said, we're going to dive into this next time, is optimistic and a focus on arete. The Hellenistic period is going to have a shift to pessimistic and a focus on how to be happy. And not just that, the philosophies are definitely going to be focusing on how to be happy, but also you have more of a realism during that period too. And what takes place in between, right, in this little place in between here, is that you have the Persian Wars that take place, and which were relatively positive as far as the outcome, because the Greeks are going to win, but it's still a long period of warfare. And then you have the Peloponnesian Wars, which is like, it's not civil war because Athens and Sparta were not the same, but it was a civil war between Greek city-states, if you will. And then you have the death of Alexander. Although the Hellenistic period is already starting to emerge before Alexander even dies. But so that you have these several events that take place between the classical and the Hellenistic period, which is why you have such a fundamental shift in how people think. And that directly reflects then their art and philosophy. So just keep that in mind. Art and philosophy is directly connected to the historical context of what was going on in society in Athens at that time. All right, so that's what we'll look at in more detail next time.